Joining us now is a member of the Senate Banking Committee, Republican Senator Mike Rounds of South Dakota, who was in that room. Thank you so much, Senator. And this morning, let's start with, do you feel like you've got a sufficient answer from these supervisors? And do you think that ultimately this will result in raising that $250,000 insurance cap?
Yeah, look, I think the regulators yesterday, I think they've begun to provide the information that we need. We're not done yet. There's at least 3 separate investigations that we'll be looking at. They went a little bit farther than what I had expected them to yesterday with regard to sharing just how serious the mistakes were that SVB made. I wasn't sure they were going to go that far. They did make it clear that there's more work to be done. They also, though, made it clear that there were clear warning signs and that the regulators had notified the bank and that they were expecting an immediate response. What he didn't give us was what that response was or how quickly it was sent back out. So those are the things that we're going to be learning more about in the next 6 weeks. This was really a hearing to set up and to make sure that they understood that there was a lot more information that we were expecting them to be able to deliver. The other piece that did not come out as well, I think, is the regulators themselves are really kind of under scrutiny. Were they using the tools that were available to them? I think they wanted to start out with their best foot forward and say, well, look, we were really working on it. But in this case, I think those are some of the questions we're going to be asking. Yeah. Were they on top of it? Did they use the tools that were available to them?
I noticed that was one of the big things you pressed on was the timeline of how long they have to respond to warnings like that. I do wonder, though, if you have a concern that this kind of creates a nationalized banking system to a degree if you are allowing officials to have regulators, pay these depositors out, even if they're uninsured, which typically would not be the case.
Yeah, I think there's 2 questions to it. First of all, did they do the right thing to protect the depositors immediately over the first couple of weeks? And I think they did. I think that helped to slow down the fear that some depositors had that a smaller bank would be at risk. With the creation of Dodd-Frank, we've really already created a tiered system in which you have some banks that are too big to fail, the biggest banks, and that almost by default would suggest that if you've got your money in one of those banks that's too big to fail, that then you don't have to worry about how large your deposit is. Whereas if you're in a medium or a small bank, are they protected? Would the federal government step in? So there is a really good question moving forward that we don't have the right answer for yet, and that is how do we take out that marketing capability that the big banks have, or that advantage that Dodd-Frank provides to them being too big to fail? Part of that could be an increase in the size of the deposit protection program, but with that comes a question of who pays for that cost? Who should pick up the major cost of insuring that or paying the bill? And that I think is something that we want to do after we get all the facts in. Then we can sit down and we can actually talk about long-term what is the best way to approach it so that we don't have that disadvantage for small and medium-sized banks.
Senator, after the shooting in Nashville, President Biden called on Congress to pass an assault weapons ban again. Do you think that there should be action here in the wake of that shooting?
I put myself in a position where I look at those families and I see these things, and I look at my colleagues up here, and there isn't anybody here that if they could find the right approach wouldn't try to do something because they feel that pain. And yet when we start talking about bans or challenging on the Second Amendment, I think the things that have already been done have gone about as far as we're going to with gun control. I do think there are some things that can be done, and let me just give you one example. It's one that we already started working on. We've already introduced legislation. We've got about $500 million that we think over a 5-year period of time that's already been allocated for putting in solar panels at schools. Could we reallocate that back over a 5-year period of time, provide grants back to the states, and allow them to go back in and help individual school districts to actually protect those schools, make them more difficult to get into? Yesterday, one of the things we found out was that in the manifesto that this individual had published, they actually looked at other locations and decided this was the least safe location, and they walked away from some of the others. Maybe, as we take small steps, but more steps to take care of our kids and to prevent these kinds of things, maybe the next step should be, how do we protect those most vulnerable in our society at a place where they should absolutely be safe?
It's pretty stark to hear you say that you don't think there's anything else legislatively that Congress can do when it comes to guns. You voted against the gun safety legislation that was passed and signed into law last year. Some of your Republican colleagues voted against or voted for it. Do you still stand by that vote, Senator?
I do.
Why?
Look, in this case, it's a matter of implementation. And when we start talking about implementing, let's find out exactly what does happen with regard to mental health. And do you have the appropriate safeguards to protect individuals who are being accused of not having or not being able to get a weapon? You know, let's work our way through those. That particular piece of legislation has not even been implemented yet to the full extent. But I'm not prepared to start talking about implementing more stuff when we know right now that we could be making our schools safer than what they are today if they had the resources to do so. And we know, based on yesterday's activities, that this particular shooter went out of their way to try to go to one where there was less protection than at other locations.
Well, the shooter also purchased these guns legally, we are told. The shooter had an emotional disorder, according to the shooter's family, yet they were still able to get access to these guns. Do you think Tennessee needs a red flag law? Is that clear that that would have helped here?
Look, I think there's a little bit more involved in this, and I'll just give you an example. I remember years ago when I was governor in South Dakota, there was actually the move on the part of the federal government at that time to try to look individually at veterans coming home who were asking for emotional or help working their way back out of a war zone back into life back home. And they actually were trying to look at the medical records to determine whether or not they should be put on a list that would have prohibited them from actually getting a gun. These were the folks that were trying to get help. So when we start talking about whether or not we should prohibit someone from being able to exercise a Second Amendment right because they've asked for help, I think we're starting to move down the wrong direction. And this is the fine line that, I don't think anybody wants to see that happen, where you want people that are emotionally disturbed to be able to try and get help, and you don't necessarily want to just simply say that because you're getting help, you should be limited. And those are the types of things that I think make a lot of us think whether or not you want to put a red flag law in as opposed to what I would call a yellow flag, which is where you can actually go get help, but you don't have the case necessarily of having your rights being prohibited or taken away at that time. I think that's when we start to get to a point where you're really going to have a problem getting something like that through Congress.
I think there's a lot of debate on that, but one last question before you go. The former president opened up his rally in Waco, Texas on Saturday with a choir of people who have been imprisoned for their actions on January 6th singing. Do you think that was a mistake on his part?
You know, I didn't see it. I saw excerpts of it. If it highlights January 6th and what happened on January 6th, that was a bad day for America.
It does highlight it, Senator.
Yeah, and that was a bad day for America. I was there. I saw it. What happened on that day, we never want to see happen again. And so, in my opinion, if they're trying to identify that as being an appropriate response, they're wrong. And I personally think that it was the closest thing to an insurrection that we've seen in a long, long time. It was not an appropriate thing to have happen in our country, and I don't want to see it happen again.
Senator Rounds, thank you for your time this morning on all of these very important issues. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.